The hungriest heart is not always the one asking for food. Station Greyfall drifted alone beyond the frozen rings of a forgotten moon, its aging metal frame groaning softly each time another wave of solar wind brushed against its weakened shields. Frost clung to every viewing window, turning the endless stars outside into blurred patches of silver light, while inside the refugee station, warmth had become more valuable than money, and a hot meal had become more precious than promises. The ventilation system breathed with a tired mechanical rhythm that echoed through narrow corridors lined with exhausted travelers from dozens of distant worlds. Nobody spoke louder than necessary. Hunger had a way of making every conversation shorter. Daniel Carter stepped away from Cargo Bay 12 with slow, measured footsteps, pulling the zipper of his faded gray work jacket closer against the cold air that slipped through the aging station walls. At 35, his face carried the quiet lines of someone who had learned that survival often depended more on patience than strength. His hands were rough from years of loading freight containers, repairing broken transport systems, and accepting jobs nobody else wanted. Around his wrist hung a faded identification band that simply read Civilian Logistics Worker. No medals, no impressive title, just another human trying to make it through another day. A small insulated container rested in his hands. Inside waited his only meal until the following morning, a modest protein ration still warm enough to release gentle steam whenever he loosened the lid. The comforting smell drifted upward, reminding him how long it had been since he had eaten anything fresh. His stomach tightened immediately. He smiled to himself. At least it was honest enough to complain. Ahead of him, the station cafeteria stretched across a wide chamber filled with folding tables, recycled oxygen plants, and rows of emergency heating lamps glowing with soft orange light. Families huddled together beneath warm blankets. Elderly refugees quietly stirred cups of recycled broth. Volunteers distributed bottled water with careful precision because every ounce had to be counted. Above the serving counter, a flickering display repeated the same message every 15 seconds. Emergency supplies delayed. Estimated arrival unknown. Nobody looked surprised anymore. Hope had become something people measured one shipment at a time. Daniel found an empty seat near one of the frosted observation windows. Beyond the glass, silent stars watched without judgment while tiny snow-like crystals drifted across the station hall. He carefully opened the insulated container. Warm air escaped into the cold room. The rich scent of vegetables and seasoned protein briefly overpowered the metallic smell of machinery. For a single peaceful moment, the station almost felt like home. Then he heard it. Not crying, not begging, just the quiet sound of an empty stomach that had gone too long without food. Daniel looked toward the relief line forming near the opposite wall. A woman wearing a worn blue-gray cloak stood near the back, holding the hand of a small alien girl with luminous sapphire blue skin and silver eyes that seemed much older than childhood should allow. The little girl never asked for food. She simply watched other children receiving small bowls while gently squeezing her mother's hand, as though reassuring her that everything would somehow be all right. The woman lowered her head, trying to hide both exhaustion and pride beneath the shadow of her hood. Daniel could not hear their conversation, but he noticed the mother quietly smile at her daughter despite having nothing left to offer except that smile. The little girl smiled back anyway. Around them, people continued eating in silence, pretending not to notice because pretending was easier than admitting there was never enough for everyone. Daniel slowly looked back at the warm meal resting in front of him. Steam still rose from the container in thin silver ribbons before disappearing into the cold station air. He reached for the spoon, but somehow his hand stopped halfway, while across the cafeteria the little girl looked away from the food entirely, as though she had already decided that hoping hurt more than hunger. Daniel Carter kept staring at the warm meal long after the steam had begun to fade. Around him, spoons gently touched metal bowls while tired conversations rose and disappeared beneath the constant whisper of the station ventilation fans. Nobody laughed inside the cafeteria anymore. Even children had learned to eat quietly, as though making too much noise might somehow consume more food. Daniel finally lifted the spoon, but before it reached the container, another announcement echoed through the room. Attention all residents. Supply convoy remains delayed. Current food reserves have entered emergency conservation status. Please remain calm while distribution schedules are updated. The message ended with a soft electronic tone that sounded strangely polite for such terrible news. Several people lowered their heads. Others simply continued eating, pretending they had expected nothing different. Daniel slowly set the spoon back down. Across the room, the relief line moved forward one person at a time until the woman wearing the worn blue-gray cloak finally reached the serving counter. A volunteer checked the inventory display, paused, then quietly shook his head with genuine regret. The woman thanked him anyway. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply accepted the empty reality before taking her daughter's hand once again. Daniel noticed the little girl smile up at her mother, as though trying to comfort her instead. That small smile somehow hurt more than tears ever could. The pair walked toward the far corner of the cafeteria, where several old heating pipes filled the air with a little extra warmth. The girl carefully sat on the floor beside the wall, hugging her knees beneath the oversized cloak while her silver eyes wandered toward the frosted observation window instead of the empty serving counter. She never looked at the people eating nearby, almost as if she believed that watching someone else's meal would be impolite. Daniel quietly closed the lid of his own container. The comforting smell disappeared immediately. He stood and carried the insulated box across the cafeteria, each step echoing softly against the worn metal floor. A few people glanced toward him before returning to their meals. Nobody expected anything unusual. When Daniel stopped beside the little girl, she looked up with gentle surprise. Her mother instinctively shifted slightly between them, protective without appearing hostile. Daniel understood immediately. Life had taught her to question unexpected kindness. He crouched until he was at eye level with the child and placed the warm container carefully on the floor between them. "I think this belongs to someone who needs it more," he said with a quiet smile. The little girl blinked once before looking toward her mother instead of the food. She waited. Permission mattered more than hunger. Soraya Vaughn studied Daniel's face carefully, searching for hidden motives, false generosity, or the familiar expression people wore when they expected gratitude in return. She found none of them. Only tired gray eyes and the simple patience of an ordinary man. "Why?" she asked softly. Daniel shrugged almost awkwardly. "Because children should not go to sleep hungry." Soraya looked down at the unopened container. Warmth still escaped through the edges of the lid, enough to fog the cold air between them. She hesitated. "You may need this more than we do." Daniel smiled faintly. "I have skipped dinner before." He did not mention that it had happened more often than he cared to remember. The little girl slowly reached toward the container, but stopped just short of touching it. "May I?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. "Of course." Tiny fingers carefully lifted the lid. Fresh steam rose once again into the cold cafeteria, carrying the gentle scent of seasoned vegetables and warm broth. The little girl's silver eyes widened with quiet wonder, not because the meal was large, but because someone had chosen to share it without being asked. For the first time since Daniel had noticed her across the room, hope returned to her face before the first bite ever reached her lips. The little girl did not reach for the spoon immediately. Instead, she gently cupped the warm container with both hands, closing her eyes for a brief moment as though trying to remember what real warmth felt like. The rising steam drifted across her sapphire blue face, softening the tired expression she had carried since Daniel first noticed her across the cafeteria. Around them, conversations quietly faded. A few nearby refugees pretended not to watch, but kindness was rare enough on Station Greyfall that even strangers recognized it when they saw it. Soraya remained kneeling beside her daughter, her silver eyes fixed on Daniel with cautious disbelief. She had crossed too many borders, hidden from too many patrols, and trusted too many promises that eventually dissolved into betrayal. Experience had taught her that gifts almost always arrived attached to invisible conditions. Yet this human had offered the only meal he possessed and had not even asked their names. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying more weight than their quiet volume suggested. Daniel simply nodded. "You do not owe me anything." Soraya searched his face once more, almost hoping to discover some hidden expectation she had somehow missed. There was none. He stood slowly and prepared to leave, believing the moment had already ended. Then a small voice stopped him. "Sir." Daniel turned. The little girl looked up while carefully holding the spoon in one hand. "Would you sit with us?" The request caught him by surprise. He hesitated for only a second before lowering himself onto the empty floor beside them. The heating pipe behind the wall released a gentle wave of warmth every few moments, making this forgotten corner of the cafeteria feel slightly less cold than the rest of the station. The little girl smiled shyly before taking her first careful spoonful. She did not rush. She did not eat like someone afraid the food might disappear. Instead, she closed her eyes and quietly savored every bite with almost ceremonial gratitude. Daniel found himself smiling without realizing it. "What is your name?" he asked. The little girl glanced toward her mother for permission. Soraya gave the smallest nod. "Alira," she answered. "My name is Alira." "That is a beautiful name," Daniel replied. Alira lowered her eyes with a bashful smile. After another small bite, she paused. Without saying a word, she carefully scooped half of the remaining meal into the lid of the container and held it toward Daniel with both hands. "For you," she whispered. Daniel blinked in surprise. "No, Alira, that is yours." She gently shook her head. "Mother says food tastes better when nobody eats alone." Soraya looked away for a brief moment, embarrassed that her daughter had remembered words she herself had almost forgotten believing. Daniel stared at the small portion resting in the lid. It was barely enough for a few bites, yet somehow it felt larger than any feast he had ever been offered. Slowly, he accepted it. "Then we will share," he said warmly. Alira's smile grew brighter than any light inside the cafeteria. Across the room, an elderly volunteer quietly wiped moisture from the corner of his eye before returning to his work. Even the station seemed calmer for a little while. Outside the frosted observation window, distant stars continued shining with quiet indifference. Inside Station Greyfall, however, three strangers shared a simple meal, and for the first time in many difficult weeks, hope occupied a place at the table alongside hunger. The warmth of the shared meal faded long before the memory of it did. The empty container rested between them like a quiet reminder that kindness could fill spaces food alone never could. Around the cafeteria, people gradually returned to their own conversations, but the atmosphere had changed in ways no station report would ever record. A few strangers offered tired smiles to one another. An elderly refugee slid half of his bread toward the woman sitting beside him without saying a word. Somewhere near the serving counter, a volunteer quietly added an extra cup of warm water to another family's tray. Compassion, Daniel realized, spread more quietly than fear, but often traveled farther. He stood and picked up the empty container, preparing to return it to the washing station. Before he could leave, Soraya spoke again. "You have given away the only meal you had today." It was not a question. Daniel smiled with quiet honesty. "I have gone hungry before." Soraya lowered her eyes. "That does not make it easier." Daniel looked toward the frosted observation window where tiny crystals drifted across the darkness of space like frozen rain. "No," he admitted softly. "It does not." For a few moments, none of them spoke. Only the gentle hum of the heating pipes filled the silence. Alira leaned lightly against her mother's shoulder, looking far more comfortable than when Daniel had first seen her. Color had returned to her sapphire blue cheeks, and the constant tension around her silver eyes had softened into the peaceful curiosity every child deserved to have. She watched snow-like ice particles floating beyond the window, as though imagining entire worlds hidden inside the stars. Then the station lights flickered once. The interruption lasted less than a second before emergency power stabilized the electrical grid. Almost immediately, another announcement echoed through the cafeteria. "Attention, all residents. An unidentified government convoy has entered Station Greyfall security space. Please remain calm while docking procedures are completed." The room grew noticeably quieter. Refugees exchanged uncertain glances. Government inspections rarely brought good news to forgotten places like Greyfall. Soraya's expression changed instantly. The calm she had carefully maintained disappeared beneath a shadow of unmistakable concern. Almost without thinking, she pulled the hood of her worn cloak farther over her silver hair and gently guided Alira closer to her side. Daniel noticed the movement immediately. It was not the reaction of someone nervous about paperwork. It was the instinct of someone accustomed to hiding. He chose not to ask questions. Everyone on Greyfall carried stories they were not ready to tell. Through the frosted observation glass, several sleek silver ships slowly emerged from the darkness, their polished hulls reflecting the pale light of the nearby moon. Unlike cargo freighters or relief transports, these vessels moved with perfect formation, every course adjustment synchronized with precise discipline. Even from a distance, they carried the unmistakable appearance of official authority. A young station technician hurried through the cafeteria toward the operations deck, whispering to another employee as he passed. "Those are not supply ships." "Who are they?" the other worker asked quietly. The technician swallowed before answering. "Royal Registry." Daniel glanced toward Soraya. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around Elira's hand. The little girl looked up at her mother with innocent confusion, unaware that the warmth they had briefly found inside a shared meal was beginning to collide with a past that had never truly stopped searching for them. Outside, the silver ships settled into silent orbit around Station Greyfall, their navigation lights glowing steadily against the endless darkness, while somewhere deep inside the station, a series of secure communication channels awakened after years of silence. The cafeteria emptied more quickly than usual after the announcement, leaving behind only the quiet scrape of chairs, the distant hum of air recyclers, and the faint scent of warm broth that seemed to linger long after every bowl had been cleared away. Daniel carried the washed food container back toward the storage shelf, then paused beside the frosted observation window. Outside, the silver government ships remained perfectly still above Station Greyfall, their navigation lights glowing with calm precision against the endless darkness. They were not warships. They did not project intimidation. Somehow, that made them even more unsettling. Organizations that relied upon certainty rarely needed to display force. Behind him, Soraya gently adjusted the worn cloak around Elira's shoulders. The little girl leaned against her mother, quietly tracing invisible patterns across the fogged window with one fingertip. She appeared fascinated by the drifting lights outside, completely unaware of the fear hidden inside the adults surrounding her. Daniel noticed Soraya watching every entrance to the cafeteria instead of the ships. It was the careful attention of someone who expected familiar footsteps at the worst possible moment. He slowly walked back toward them without speaking. Sometimes silence offered more comfort than questions. "Do you know who they are?" he asked after several moments. Soraya hesitated. "I know what they represent." Her answer carried enough weight to end the conversation before it truly began. Daniel respected that. He nodded once and looked back through the window. Whatever happens, they will have to pass through station administration before they reach this section. Soraya managed a faint smile. "You always sound calmer than the situation." Daniel laughed quietly. "Somebody has to." Elira looked up between them with innocent curiosity. "Do all humans stay calm when they are hungry?" Daniel smiled. "No, I am still hungry. I just try not to let hunger make my decisions for me." The little girl considered those words very carefully, as though storing them somewhere important. Before she could answer, another announcement echoed softly throughout the station. "Docking sequence completed. Government delegation has requested temporary access to public registry records and civilian assistance logs." Several refugees nearby immediately exchanged nervous glances. Administrative inspections usually meant delays, interviews, or identity verification. Volunteers began organizing paperwork while station employees hurried toward the central operations office carrying portable data terminals. Daniel watched the activity without much concern until one exhausted records clerk passed the cafeteria entrance holding a stack of printed relief reports. A single page slipped from the pile and drifted onto the floor. Daniel instinctively picked it up before it disappeared beneath someone's boots. The clerk accepted it gratefully. "Thank you. We are trying to identify everyone who received emergency food today." Daniel frowned slightly. "Why would that matter?" The clerk lowered his voice. "The delegation specifically requested records involving one child who unexpectedly received a civilian ration instead of an official distribution package." Daniel looked toward Soraya. She had heard every word. The color slowly faded from her already pale blue face. Elira reached for her mother's hand without understanding why it suddenly trembled. The clerk hurried away before Daniel could ask another question. For several long seconds, none of them moved. The station around them continued its ordinary routine, yet everything suddenly felt different. Somewhere inside the administrative wing, names were being compared against databases older than the station itself. Somewhere aboard the silent silver ships, Someone had already begun following a trail that started not with politics, power, or military intelligence, but with one simple act of kindness recorded inside an ordinary relief log. Daniel looked at the empty food container still resting in his hands and quietly realized that sharing a meal had become part of a story far larger than any of them had imagined. The station clocks marked another hour, yet time itself seemed unwilling to move. Outside the observation windows, the silver government vessels remained suspended in perfect formation, their polished hulls reflecting the pale glow of the frozen moon. They neither advanced nor retreated. They simply waited with the quiet confidence of those who already knew the ending of the story. Inside Station Greyfall, however, uncertainty settled over every corridor like another layer of frost. Volunteers continued distributing blankets. Mechanics repaired aging air filters. Children quietly gathered around portable heaters. Life struggled forward because it had no other choice. Daniel placed the empty food container back onto the cafeteria shelf and glanced toward Soraya and Alira. Neither had moved very far. The little girl leaned comfortably against her mother's shoulder, but Soraya's attention never drifted far from the station entrances. Her eyes constantly measured every passing stranger, every security officer, every announcement. Daniel recognized that expression. It belonged to someone who had spent too many years expecting bad news before good news ever had a chance to arrive. "You should get some rest," Daniel said gently. Soraya offered a tired smile. Rest is difficult when the past finally catches up. Daniel folded his arms against the cool air. Whatever they are looking for, hiding forever rarely solves it. Soraya looked toward the frosted window. Sometimes hiding is the only reason a child survives long enough to have a future. Before Daniel could answer, soft footsteps echoed through the cafeteria. A station administrator wearing a dark gray operations jacket approached slowly, holding a digital tablet against his chest. His expression carried none of the usual authority of an official inspection. Instead, he appeared strangely uncertain. "Excuse me," he said politely. "We have been reviewing today's civilian assistance records." Daniel nodded. "I signed for my meal this morning." The administrator glanced down at the tablet before looking toward Alira. The visiting delegation requested permission to personally thank the individual whose emergency ration was voluntarily transferred to a child outside scheduled distribution. Daniel blinked in confusion. "Thank me." That is all they said. Soraya's breathing became almost imperceptibly slower. She understood far more than Daniel did. The administrator continued. "The delegation also requested that the child and her guardian accompany the meeting if they agree." Silence settled over the small group. Nearby conversations faded as a few curious refugees noticed the unexpected invitation. Daniel looked toward Soraya, without pressure or expectation. "It is your decision," he said quietly. Soraya lowered her eyes to Alira, who looked back with calm innocence. There was no fear in the little girl's silver eyes now, only trust. She reached into the pocket of her oversized cloak and carefully removed a tiny crystal pendant shaped like a star. It caught the orange glow of the heating lamps, scattering delicate reflections across the metal floor. "Mother," Alira whispered, "I do not want to hide anymore." Soraya closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, years of exhaustion seemed to lift from her shoulders. She gently brushed a strand of silver hair away from Alira's face and nodded once. "Then we will stop running." Daniel watched the exchange without fully understanding its meaning, but he recognized its importance. Some decisions were larger than explanations. Together, the three of them followed the administrator through the quiet corridors of Station Greyfall. Refugees paused respectfully as they passed. The distant hum of the docking bay grew louder with every step. Beyond the massive airlock doors, the waiting silver delegation stood beneath bright landing lights, perfectly still beneath banners bearing a constellation Daniel had never seen before. He believed he was walking toward a simple meeting of gratitude. He had no idea that within the next few minutes, the entire galaxy would learn the name of the little girl who had shared half of a single meal with a hungry stranger. The massive docking doors opened with a slow mechanical sigh, releasing a stream of crisp air that carried the faint scent of frozen metal and distant cedar resin from the government vessels outside. Brilliant white landing lights stretched across the polished floor, transforming the worn station corridor into something almost ceremonial. Daniel walked beside Soraya and Elira without speaking, his boots echoing softly against the steel beneath his feet. Refugees gathered quietly behind the security barriers, watching through transparent partitions with the silent curiosity that always followed important visitors. No one knew why an ordinary logistics worker, a tired alien mother, and her little daughter had been invited to meet an official delegation. They simply watched history approach one careful step at a time. Beyond the threshold, a long line of uniformed officials stood beneath banners embroidered with silver constellations that shimmered gently under the docking lights. Their polished armor reflected the frozen glow of space, yet none of them reached for weapons or issued commands. Instead, every pair of eyes settled upon the small alien girl holding her mother's hand. Daniel noticed something unusual immediately. None of them looked surprised. They looked relieved. The tallest official slowly stepped forward. His silver cloak carried the insignia of the Galactic Regency, stitched with delicate threads that caught every beam of light. His face revealed the exhaustion of someone who had spent many months searching without success. When he finally stood a few feet away from Elira, he lowered himself onto one knee. The motion happened so naturally that it seemed practiced long before this day. Every official behind him followed without hesitation. The entire docking bay became perfectly silent. Daniel instinctively looked around, assuming the gesture was meant for someone else. It was not. The elderly official gently bowed his head before speaking in a calm voice that carried through the enormous chamber. "Your Highness, the search is over. The galaxy has been waiting for your safe return." Daniel slowly turned toward Elira. The little girl did not appear frightened. She simply looked at her mother with quiet uncertainty. Soraya closed her eyes briefly before placing one gentle hand upon her daughter's shoulder. "You do not have to hide anymore," she whispered. Elira took one small step forward. The silver pendant hanging around her neck suddenly responded to unseen sensors inside the docking bay. A soft golden light spread through the crystal star, projecting an elegant constellation above her head. The holographic pattern rotated slowly, and every official lowered their heads even farther. The station administrator standing beside Daniel quietly gasped. Refugees behind the security barrier exchanged stunned whispers that quickly faded back into respectful silence. The constellation hovering above Elira matched the royal emblem displayed on every government vessel outside the station. Daniel finally understood why Soraya had feared every announcement, every inspection, and every unfamiliar face. They had never been ordinary refugees. They had been protecting the last visible heir to the Galactic Alliance, while living among strangers who never knew whom they were standing beside. The elderly official rose slowly, his eyes filled with unmistakable gratitude. "Your mother preserved the future of countless worlds," he said softly. "But today we also learned something unexpected." He turned toward Daniel. "Our records show that before we found our future sovereign, someone else found her first. Not because of duty, not because of law, simply because she was hungry." Hundreds of eyes shifted toward the quiet human standing near the edge of the gathering. Daniel felt strangely uncomfortable beneath so much attention. He looked down at the empty insulated food container still hanging from one hand and almost smiled. He had believed it was only a simple lunch. Standing beneath the brilliant docking lights, surrounded by officials from across the galaxy, he quietly realized that the smallest act of kindness had become the moment every history book had been waiting to record. The silence inside the docking bay lasted far longer than anyone expected. Even the steady hum of the station seemed softer, as though the machinery itself had paused to witness the impossible. Daniel stood motionless, the empty insulated food container still resting in one hand, while dozens of officials remained respectfully bowed before the little girl who had shared half of a simple meal only an hour earlier. Nothing about Elira changed. She still wore the same oversized cloak. She still held her mother's hand. She still looked more interested in the drifting frost beyond the docking doors than the ranks of dignitaries surrounding her. It was that contrast that struck Daniel most deeply. Titles had transformed the room, but they had not transformed the child. Soraya slowly exhaled, as though releasing the weight she had carried for years. The tension that had lived quietly behind every smile finally disappeared from her face. She gently brushed a loose strand of silver hair away from Elira's forehead before looking toward the elderly regent. She deserves a childhood before she deserves a throne, Soraya said softly. The regent lowered his head with genuine respect. That is exactly why we never stopped searching. He reached into the folds of his ceremonial cloak and removed a small crystal archive no larger than a notebook. When activated, a delicate holographic image appeared above his palm. It showed cities filled with shimmering towers, peaceful worlds connected by rivers of starlight, schools, gardens, observatories, and millions of citizens gathered beneath banners carrying the same constellation now glowing above Elira's pendant. These worlds have waited every day for hope to return, he said quietly. Elira stared at the floating images with innocent wonder. Do they know me? She whispered. The regent smiled warmly. Many have never seen your face, but they never stopped believing you were alive. Tears quietly formed in Soraya's silver eyes, though she smiled through them. Daniel remained respectfully silent. He felt like an ordinary mechanic who had accidentally wandered into the final page of someone else's history book. The regent turned toward him. Mr. Carter, the Galactic Council wishes to recognize your extraordinary compassion. We can provide wealth, citizenship on any member world, a home, or any position you desire. Hundreds of eyes settled upon Daniel once again. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly before glancing through the transparent wall toward the refugee families still gathered inside the station. Children remained wrapped in blankets. Volunteers continued counting emergency supplies. Elderly travelers still waited beside empty food dispensers. Nothing about their lives had changed simply because an heir had been found. Daniel looked back at the regent and answered with the same quiet honesty that had guided every choice he had made. If you truly want to thank me, refill the food storage here before your ships leave. Nobody on this station should have to wonder where tomorrow's meal will come from. The request echoed gently across the docking bay. Several officials exchanged surprised glances. They had expected ambition. They had prepared for negotiation. Instead, they received a reminder so simple that none of them had considered it. The regent smiled with unmistakable admiration. It will be done. Elira released her mother's hand and walked toward Daniel. She slipped her small fingers into his weathered hand exactly as she had in the cafeteria, then looked up with the brightest smile he had seen all day. I told you food tastes better when nobody eats alone. Daniel laughed softly, feeling the warmth of that simple sentence settle deeper than any reward ever could. Around them, the first cargo drones began unloading fresh supplies from the silver ships, and for the first time since Station Greyfall had drifted into hardship, hope did not arrive as a promise. It arrived in the form of open doors, shared meals, and the quiet kindness of one ordinary human that had changed the future of an entire galaxy. Several weeks later, Station Greyfall no longer sounded like a place waiting for rescue. The old ventilation system still hummed through the narrow corridors, but now its familiar rhythm mixed with children's laughter, the steady movement of supply drones, and the warm conversations of volunteers who no longer needed to count every spoonful of food before serving another family. Fresh produce filled storage shelves that had stood empty for months. Heating units operated at full capacity. Every cafeteria table carried enough meals for those who gathered there. And for the first time in a very long while, nobody hurried through dinner afraid it might be the last warm meal they would receive. Daniel Carter returned to the same corner table beside the frosted observation window, where everything had quietly begun. The stars beyond the glass looked exactly the same. Space had not changed. The galaxy had not become smaller. Yet something inside that little station had become larger than anyone could measure. A familiar pair of footsteps approached from behind. Daniel smiled before turning around. Elira, now wearing a simple blue travel coat instead of the oversized refugee cloak, carried another insulated food container with both hands. Soraya followed beside her, no longer hiding beneath a hood. The quiet dignity she had always possessed now rested openly upon her shoulders instead of behind fear. Elira carefully placed the container on the table. I asked the kitchen to make enough for 3, she said proudly. Daniel laughed softly. That sounds much better than eating alone. They shared the meal slowly while snow-like crystals drifted across the observation window beyond them. Nothing about the conversation concerned politics, royal ceremonies, or the future of the Galactic Alliance. Elira talked about wanting to visit the station school before leaving. Soraya thanked the volunteers who had protected strangers they never truly knew. Daniel explained how the maintenance crews had finally repaired the oldest heating pipes. Ordinary conversations. Ordinary moments. Somehow they felt more important than every grand announcement that had echoed through the docking bay. When the meal ended, a gentle station chime announced the departure schedule of the royal convoy. It was time. Outside, the silver ships waited beneath the frozen stars with quiet patience. Refugees, mechanics, nurses, station workers, and children lined the central corridor to say goodbye. No one had been ordered to gather. They simply came because gratitude always found its own way. Before boarding, Elira walked back toward Daniel one final time. She reached into her pocket and removed a tiny polished spoon, carefully preserved from the meal they had shared on the first day they met. "I asked them to make it silver," she said. "So I would never forget the first person who taught me that kindness can be shared like food." Daniel accepted the small gift with both hands, unable to speak for several moments. Finally, he smiled and said, "Promise me something." Elira nodded. "When you become the leader everyone believes you will be, always remember how a hungry child sees the world." She looked at him with calm certainty beyond her years. "I will remember because you remembered me first." The convoy departed quietly, disappearing into the endless field of stars beyond Station Greyfall. Daniel remained by the observation window until the final silver light faded into the darkness. He looked down at the little spoon resting in his weathered hand, then toward the busy cafeteria where another volunteer was already serving fresh meals to waiting families. Life continued exactly as it should. Years later, history would celebrate the return of a lost heir and the renewal of an entire alliance. But among the people who had lived through those days, the story was always told differently. They never began with crowns, fleets, or titles. They began with one ordinary human, one hungry little girl, and one more meal that proved the greatest civilizations are not built by those who possess the most, but by those who are willing to share what little they have.